"Turn off the machines, your daughter will come back," shouted the poor boy to the millionaire seconds before the final shutdown. The medical team tried to stop him, but he already knew about the scheme set up by the stepmother and the doctor. With a simple touch, the girl opened her eyes, alive, conscious, and ready to reveal the whole truth. That day, the street boy exposed a cold crime and saved a life that money had nearly buried. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. New York was breathing that humid August heat, the kind of weather that made people walk slower along the sidewalks of Brooklyn Heights. The heavy air carried the signature scent of the big city, hot asphalt, bus exhaust, and that indefinable mix of street food and damp earth that only someone who knew New York could identify. The old trees lining the streets seemed to wilt under the weight of the humidity, their leaves hanging as if begging for a breeze that never came. It was the kind of afternoon that made even the most hurried New Yorkers slow down, seeking shade and relief wherever they could find it. Edward Thompson wasn't used to walking slowly. For nearly 2 decades, his life had been a fast-paced sequence of meetings, negotiations, and achievements that had placed him at the top of the American textile industry. His name was synonymous with success, with a flawless career built brick by brick, contract by contract, with a determination that impressed even the most skeptical. Business magazines had dedicated entire covers to him, celebrating his entrepreneurial vision, his ability to transform a small family garment business into an empire that employed thousands and exported to dozens of countries. Edward Thompson was, in the eyes of the world, a perfect example of the American dream realized. But at the start of that year, Edward could barely remember the last time he'd thought about business. His hands, which once signed multi-million-dollar contracts with confidence, now trembled every time he pushed open the door to the hospital room where his daughter was. Sophia was only 8, but she seemed to have lived a lifetime in those last few months. The almond-shaped eyes that once sparkled with curiosity now remained almost always closed, and when they did open, they seemed to be searching for something they couldn't find. The hallways of St. Raphael's Hospital had become as familiar to Edward as the corridors of his own company. He knew every nurse by name, knew exactly when the shifts changed, and could identify the sound of each piece of medical equipment just by its hum. That place, with its pristine white walls and its characteristic smell of disinfectant mixed with medicine, had become a second home. A home he wished he'd never had to know so intimately. There were photographs of Sophia all over the room. Sophia smiling on her 7th birthday, Sophia playing in the park, Sophia hugging her father during a trip to the Hamptons. Each image was a painful reminder of who she had been before this mysterious condition turned her into the fragile girl now lying between hospital sheets. Sophia's story had begun so suddenly that Edward was still trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. In October, she was a girl full of energy, running through the halls of their mansion on the Upper East Side, making up stories for her dolls, and always asking her dad to read one more chapter before bed. She had a vivid imagination that turned every corner of the house into a stage for adventure. The garden was an enchanted forest, the pool was an ocean populated by mermaids, and her room became a medieval castle where she was the princess who saved dragons instead of being saved by knights. Edward loved that creativity, her ability to find magic in the everyday. It was a gift from her mother, he often thought, remembering how his first wife had the same knack for seeing the world with eyes full of possibilities. In November, the dizzy spells began. They were subtle at first, so light that Sophia barely mentioned them, just holding onto a wall for a second before continuing to play. Edward didn't pay much attention initially, thinking it was just fatigue from school activities, maybe the heat affecting everyone that time of year. But the spells became more frequent, more intense. Sophia started losing her balance during simple tasks, feeling nauseous for no apparent reason. It was when she fell, down the stairs for the 2nd time in a week, that Edward decided to take her to a doctor. In December, the seizures started. The first one happened during breakfast without warning, turning an ordinary morning into a terrifying nightmare. Edward would never forget the image of Sophia falling from her chair, her small body contorting in ways bodies shouldn't, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. Those were the longest 2 minutes of his life until the seizure stopped and the ambulance arrived. At the hospital, doctors talked about epilepsy, about the need for more tests, about causes that could range from genetic to environmental. Edward authorized everything, signing every form without even reading it, desperate for answers that seemed like they would never come. In January, the doctors finally gave a name to what was happening, though it was a name that brought more questions than answers. They said it was something rare, a degenerative condition that attacked the nervous system progressively and relentlessly, something that not even the best specialists could fully explain. There were only 30 documented cases in the entire world, and none with a favorable prognosis. The doctor's words echoed in Edward's mind like a recurring nightmare. Rare, degenerative, progressive, no known cure. Edward had mobilized an army of professionals, turning his personal fortune into a desperate crusade for answers and cures. Renowned neurologists, award-winning immunologists, geneticists who had studied at Harvard and Cambridge. Even doctors flown in from Boston and Zurich examined Sophia with state-of-the-art equipment. Each specialist brought a new theory, a new possibility, a new experimental protocol that promised, if not a cure, at least a chance of stabilization. Edward spent small fortunes on tests that didn't even have common names in English, on treatments that were in trial, phases in European labs, on video conferences with specialists who had never set foot in the United States, but who analyzed results remotely, searching for patterns that might point the way forward. The diagnoses varied among the specialists, creating a medical Tower of Babel that left Edward even more desperate. Some spoke of an autoimmune disorder, others suspected genetic components, and some mentioned possible exposure to environmental toxins, but they all eventually converged on the same terrifying point: a progressive degenerative condition of still unknown origin that was attacking the girl's nervous system relentlessly and, it seemed, irreversibly. The MRIs showed growing inflammation in critical areas of the brain. Blood tests revealed abnormal markers, suggesting some kind of cascade reaction that medicine didn't yet fully understand. And with each passing week, Sophia seemed to sink a little deeper into that state of fragility that tore Edward's heart apart. Melissa, Edward's new wife, had been a pillar of support during these difficult months that stretched on endlessly. They had married just a year earlier after an intense romance that blossomed during a trade show in Milan, where Edward had gone to present his new line of sustainable fabrics and Melissa was working as a PR consultant for international firms. She was 15 years younger, with a smile that lit up any room and an apparent dedication that Edward hadn't seen since losing his first wife, Sophia's mother, in a car accident a few years back. That accident had left Edward shattered, struggling to raise Sophia alone while managing an expanding business empire. When Melissa entered his life, she seemed to be exactly what he and Sophia needed: someone who could bring joy back to their quiet house, someone who understood the demands of his professional life, but also knew how to create a warm family space. Melissa took on the role of caregiver with an almost professional efficiency that impressed everyone. She organized medical appointments with military precision, talking with nurses and coordinating schedules so Edward could be present for the most important moments without completely compromising his business commitments. She ensured that every detail of Sophia's treatment was executed perfectly, from medications taken at the exact right times to the ideal room temperature for the girl's comfort. She was always present at meetings with doctors, taking detailed notes, asking intelligent questions that showed she had studied Sophia's condition extensively. Edward felt grateful to have her by his side, someone he could trust blindly while his world crumbled around him. Alongside her, always present, was Dr. Henry Allen, the personal physician Edward had hired shortly after the initial diagnosis. Henry had an impeccable resume, a private practice on the Upper East Side, and a reputation for being discreet and competent. Edward trusted him completely, not just as a professional, but as someone who seemed genuinely concerned for Sophia's well-being. The conversations between Henry and Melissa were frequent, always about medications, dosages, new experimental protocols that might help. But Sophia wasn't getting better. On the contrary, with each new medication introduced, each new treatment attempted, she seemed to waste away a little more. Edward felt helpless, trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. His meetings at the company became rare, his business decisions began to be questioned by the shareholders, and slowly he began to withdraw from everything he had built. The only thing that mattered was that fragile girl, connected to monitors and infusion pumps, who could barely whisper his name. The Thompson mansion on the Upper East Side was an imposing structure, surrounded by high walls and manicured gardens. Edward had bought the property years ago when Sophia was still little, thinking it would be the perfect home for her to grow up in. There was a playground in the backyard, a heated pool, fruit trees, and even a small ornamental pond. But it all seemed empty now, as if Sophia's lack of life had drained the vitality from the place as well. On the other side of the wall, in a completely different reality that seemed to exist in another dimension of the same city, lived Lucas. At 10 years old, the boy knew New York City. In a way, few did, especially those who lived in protected mansions on the Upper East Side. He knew exactly which street corners yielded the most change in the late afternoon, when tired workers were heading home and were more likely to share a few coins. He knew which bakeries threw out bread after 6 p.m. and had developed a friendly relationship with a few shop owners who would set food aside before tossing it. He knew which parks had working public water fountains and at what times security was less strict, allowing him to wash up without being chased away. He knew the best places to sleep when the night grew cold, the warm air vents from the subway, the sheltered corners under the awnings of office buildings, the park benches under leafy trees that offered some protection from the rain. Lucas had no family, at least not one that cared to look for him or that he remembered clearly. His earliest memories were fragmented and confusing. A woman who might have been his mother, a small dark room, screams coming from somewhere he couldn't identify. After that, just a succession of temporary shelters and permanent streets. He had grown up between institutions that did the best they could with limited resources and streets that taught hard but necessary lessons for survival, developing a precocious independence and a resourcefulness that would impress any adult. He learned early on that crying solved nothing, that complaining was a waste of energy, and that the only person he could truly rely on was himself. That August afternoon, Lucas was chasing a ball. Not just any ball, but an old, deflated soccer ball he had seen roll over the high wall of the Thompson mansion. To most people, that ball was worthless. To Lucas, it represented entertainment, companionship, an object that could turn a lonely afternoon into something minimally fun. He had debated for a few minutes before deciding to climb the wall. It was risky. There could be alarms, cameras, security guards, but the temptation was greater than the fear. The climb was easier than he expected. The wall had some irregularities that served as handholds, and Lucas, used to scaling fences and gates around the city, reached the top in less than a minute. From up high he could see the vast silent garden. No one was in sight. He jumped, down with the agility of a cat, and started searching for the ball among the bushes. That's when he saw the girl. She was sitting in a wheelchair near a large glass window that looked out onto the gardens. She was so still that Lucas, for a moment, thought she was a statue, but then she moved slightly, turning her head in his direction. Their eyes met, and something strange happened. Lucas, who usually fled from any human contact out of self-preservation, was frozen. The girl didn't scream, didn't seem scared. She simply looked at him with an expression Lucas couldn't quite decipher. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was just the reflection of someone who hadn't seen anything different within those walls for a very long time. Lucas approached slowly, completely forgetting about the ball. When he got closer, he noticed the girl was very pale, very thin, and that there were thin tubes connected to her arm. She tried to smile, but the effort seemed too great. Lucas didn't know what to say. He wasn't used to conversations, much less with someone who looked so fragile. It was then that he did something that surprised even himself. He pulled a piece of bread from his worn-out pants pocket, which he had saved from breakfast at a church soup kitchen. It was a bit squashed, but still good. He offered it to the girl with a shy gesture. Sophia looked at the bread, then at Lucas, and something in her face changed. That simple, unpretentious gesture touched her in a way no medicine had. She shook her head slightly, as if to say she couldn't eat, but her eyes shone with a silent gratitude. Lucas sat on the ground near the wheelchair and started talking. He didn't know exactly what to say, so he talked about simple things. About the city, about the birds he saw in Central Park, about how he sometimes slept looking at the stars and made up constellations with funny names. Sophia listened, and though she didn't respond, her expression changed subtly, as if each word were a small spark of life entering her tired body. Time passed without either of them noticing. It was only when he heard voices coming from inside the house that Lucas realized the danger. He stood up quickly, but before he left, he promised Sophia he would come back. He didn't know why he'd made that promise, but something inside him felt he had to keep it. In the following days, Lucas developed a risky routine. Every afternoon, as the sun began to set, he would climb the Thompsons' wall and spend a few hours with Sophia. Sometimes he brought flowers he'd picked along the way, other times small drawings he made with charcoal on pieces of cardboard. Sophia began to react in subtle but significant ways. Her eyes followed Lucas's movements with more attention. Sometimes she would try to lift her hand to touch the objects he brought, and on one memorable occasion, she managed to whisper a thank you so quietly that Lucas almost didn't hear it. Edward, immersed in his grief and endless medical consultations, didn't notice the initial change in Sophia. But Melissa did. She had a keen eye for any alteration in the girl's condition, and that subtle improvement did not go unnoticed. She began to watch more closely, to ask the nurses questions, to review the medication schedules. It was during one of her routine inspections of the gardens that she discovered the small gifts left by Lucas. A dried flower near the chair, a drawing taped to the window, a colorful pebble on the windowsill. The discovery triggered an immediate reaction. Melissa increased security, installed additional cameras, and gave express orders that any intruder was to be prevented from entering the property. When she finally caught Lucas trying to climb the wall, she confronted him personally, with a speech that mixed authority and a veiled threat. She said he was disturbing a seriously ill child, that his presence was inappropriate, and that if he returned, more severe measures would be taken. Lucas tried to explain, tried to say that Sophia was getting better, that she seemed happier when he was there, but his words sounded weak against Melissa's firmness. He was escorted off the property, and physical barriers were installed to ensure he wouldn't return. The wall was raised in some spots, and security guards were instructed to make more frequent rounds. Isolated again, Sophia began to decline with a speed that frightened even the most experienced doctors. In a matter of days, she stopped opening her eyes, stopped reacting to stimuli, and her breathing became so shallow that the machines had to be constantly adjusted. Edward panicked. He convened new medical boards, authorized experimental treatments, made desperate promises to doctors and to deities he wasn't even sure he believed in. It was during one of those endless nights at the hospital that Dr. Allen suggested it might be time to accept the inevitable, to let Sophia go in peace without more suffering. Edward vehemently refused, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and as he fought against despair, Sophia lay in a hospital bed, connected to machines that breathed for her, surrounded by people who claimed to love her but far from the one presence that had managed to make her feel alive again. Outside that world of white walls and cold lights, Lucas wandered the streets of New York with a weight in his chest he had never felt before. For the first time in his life, he had a reason to be somewhere, someone who depended on him, even if it was just to hear silly stories and see drawings made with charcoal. And now, that reason had been torn from him with the same brutality with which everything had always been torn from his life. But this time something was different. This time, Lucas wasn't just going to accept it and move on. The early morning in New York had a particular quality that Lucas knew well, a strange intimacy that only those who inhabited the streets after nightfall could truly understand. It was the time when the city seemed to pause for breath, when even the endless traffic on the FDR Drive dwindled to a distant, almost melancholy murmur. The immense buildings that pulsed with energy and movement during the day now became silent giants. their dark windows like the closed eyes of sleeping creatures. The air cooled slightly, bringing with it different smells than those of the day, less exhaust and more dew, less street food and more damp concrete. It was also the time when Lucas could think most clearly, without the constant noise that filled his days, without the need to be ever vigilant for food opportunities or potential dangers. Sitting on a bench in Union Square, wrapped in a thin blanket he'd gotten from a woman from a local church weeks ago during a blanket drive, Lucas tried to make sense of the whirlwind of thoughts and emotions that had taken over his mind in the last few days. The blanket still smelled faintly of laundry detergent and had small flowers embroidered on the corners, a touch of delicacy that seemed incongruous with the harshness of his daily reality. He valued it enormously, not just for the warmth it provided on cold nights, but because it represented one of the few acts of genuine kindness he had received without having to ask or do anything in return. The image of Sophia wouldn't leave his head, remaining there like a constant presence that accompanied him at every moment. He saw her constantly, not just when he closed his eyes, but in every reflection, in every shadow, in every child who walked down the street with their parents. That pale face, those eyes that seemed to silently plead for help, that faint but genuine smile when she recognized him, they pierced his thoughts with a persistence he had never experienced before. Lucas didn't understand much about illness or medicine. His limited knowledge came from what he'd overheard in street conversations or seen on television programs through store windows. But he understood loneliness deeply, that feeling of being completely alone even when surrounded by people. And he recognized in Sophia the same kind of isolation he himself carried like a second skin, just manifested differently, and perhaps even more cruelly. While he was invisible to the world by choice and circumstance, having learned to move through the shadows without drawing attention, Sophia was invisible because her body had become a prison from which she couldn't escape, trapped inside herself while the world kept spinning around her. The decision to go back wasn't rational. Lucas knew the risks, knew the woman had been clear in her threats, knew security guards would be on alert. But there was something bigger than fear pulsing inside him, something he had never felt before and was only now beginning to understand. It was responsibility. Sophia needed him, not doctors with their incomprehensible jargon, not machines that beeped and flashed, but him, with his silly stories, his simple and unpretentious presence. But going back alone would be useless. He knew that with the same certainty, he knew the sun would rise in the morning. He needed help, someone who could listen to what he had to say and had the power to do something about it, someone who could translate his hesitant words into concrete action. For 2 exhausting days, Lucas tried to approach people in the vicinity of the Thompson mansion, carefully selecting those who seemed to have the time and willingness to listen. He spoke to security guards from other buildings during their coffee breaks, to shopkeepers in corner stores during slower hours, to taxi drivers waiting for fares who seemed bored. He told them about the sick girl, trying to use words that sounded credible and urgent at the same time. He talked about how she had improved when he was around, about the strangeness of being thrown out so vehemently and with threats just for keeping a lonely child company who clearly benefited from his presence. But his words were met with suspicion or indifference, as if they were just more noise in the urban cacophony. People looked him up and down, noticing his tattered clothes, his worn-out shoes, the dirt that collected under his fingernails despite his efforts to stay clean. A street kid talking about the daughter of a rich businessman, making veiled accusations about inadequate medical treatment, sounded too fanciful to be taken seriously, too delusional to deserve attention. Some dismissed him with impatient gestures, others offered a few coins as if that would solve any problem, and the cruelest simply laughed, suggesting he should find something more productive to do than invent stories about rich families. It was frustration that led him back to the Thompsons' wall on that 3rd night. Lucas no longer had an elaborate plan, just the urgent need to see Sophia again, to know how she was. The property was different. There was more lighting, visible cameras in strategic spots, and he could see at least 2 security guards patrolling the garden. Getting in through the front would be impossible, but Lucas hadn't survived on the streets by being predictable. He knew the blind spots, knew where the shadows were deepest, and had developed an almost animalistic instinct for identifying opportunities. He waited patiently until the guards completed a round and moved away. Then, taking advantage of a moment when their attention was turned to another part of the property, he scaled the wall at a less illuminated point. His hands found purchase on the same irregularities as before, and in seconds he was on the other side, crouched among the bushes, controlling his breathing and planning his next move. The house was quiet, but there were lights on in some windows. Lucas moved like a shadow, skirting the gardens and approaching the window where he used to find Sophia. The wheelchair was no longer there. The room was empty. A chill ran down his spine. Where was she? What had happened? That's when he heard the voices. They were coming from inside the house, from somewhere nearby. Lucas crept closer to a slightly open window, careful not to be seen. The conversation was between two people, and he immediately recognized the voice of Sophia's stepmother. The other voice was male, calm and controlled, probably the doctor he had seen a few times during his secret visits. What Lucas heard in the following minutes made his blood run cold. They spoke about Sophia with a clinical coldness that didn't match the concern they were supposed to show. They discussed adjustments to medications, but not in the way doctors would normally discuss treatments. There was something calculated there, something that sounded more like strategy than genuine medical care. They mentioned medical records that needed to be adjusted, tests that should show certain results, and something about legal documents that needed to be finalized before it was too late. But what truly shocked Lucas was when he heard them talk about Edward himself. They said he was becoming more and more emotionally fragile, that it would be easy to convince him he was making irrational decisions, that psychological evaluations were already being prepared to, if necessary, remove him from making decisions about Sophia and his own companies. They talked about inheritances, about controlling shares, about how much longer they would need to maintain this situation before they could finally let things take their natural course. Lucas didn't fully understand all the technical words they used, but the essence of the conversation was crystal clear. These people weren't trying to save Sophia. They were doing the opposite. And Edward, blinded by grief and trust, couldn't see what was happening right under his nose. The boy felt sick, confused, terrified. What could he do with this information? Who would believe him? A sudden noise snapped him out of his thoughts. One of the security guards was approaching, making his nightly rounds. Lucas had no time to think. He just ran. He sprinted across the gardens, leaped over flower beds, dodged trees, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would explode in his chest. He heard shouts behind him, the sound of heavy footsteps, but his agility and knowledge of the terrain gave him enough of an advantage to reach the wall and scale it before they caught him. On the other side, he kept running for several blocks until he was sure he wasn't being followed. Only then did he stop, leaning against a lamppost, panting and trembling. Adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but his mind was already working feverishly. He knew where Sophia was. During the conversation, they had mentioned she had been transferred to a private hospital in Midtown, where she could be monitored 24 hours a day. They mentioned the hospital's name, St. Clair's. Lucas knew the place. He'd passed by it a few times on his wanderings. But getting to Sophia in a hospital would be infinitely harder than getting into a mansion. There would be receptionists, security guards, nurses, visitors. A street kid wouldn't go unnoticed. Still, Lucas knew he had to try. He couldn't just leave Sophia in the hands of those people, not now that he knew the truth. But he needed a plan, something more concrete than just showing up and hoping to be heard. He spent the rest of the night walking the streets, thinking. At dawn, he had an idea. He remembered a small, old tape recorder he had found a few weeks ago in a trash can near Fifth Avenue. At the time, he thought he could sell it for a few bucks, but he ended up keeping it because he liked hearing his own voice recorded, something that always made him laugh. The recorder still worked, though the batteries were weak. If he could get back to the mansion, if he could record that conversation, maybe he would have concrete proof, something that couldn't be ignored or discredited. The decision was made. Lucas spent the day preparing, finding new batteries at a store that gave them away with other purchases, testing the recorder to make sure it was working perfectly. That evening, As the New York sky turned that polluted orange color that precedes complete darkness, he returned to the Thompson mansion for the third time. This time, he was even more careful. He watched the guards' patterns for almost an hour before making a move. He identified the camera's blind spots, memorized the intervals between patrols. When he finally got in, he moved with surgical precision, as if every step had been choreographed. He reached the same window as before and positioned himself in the shadows, with the recorder on and ready. He got lucky. Melissa and Dr. Allen were having another of their conversations, this time even more explicit. They talked about how Sophia was responding exactly as expected, how her body was reacting to the medications in a way that presented symptoms justifying an increasingly grave prognosis. They discussed the right moment to suggest to Edward that it might be more humane to turn off the life support machines, to let nature take its course. They mentioned recently updated insurance policies, documents that needed a final signature, lawyers who were being prepped to contest any resistance from Edward. The recorder captured everything, every word, every pause, every cynical laugh that escaped between the technical phrases. When the conversation ended and the two figures moved away, Lucas remained motionless for a few more minutes, making sure they were truly alone before turning off the device. His heart was beating so hard he was sure someone could hear it. The escape was as careful as the entry. Lucas now knew every shadow, every hiding spot, every available second between patrols. When he finally scaled the wall for the last time and his feet touched the ground on the other side, he felt as if he had completed the most important mission of his life. He held in his hands not just a recording, but the truth. Now he had to get that truth to the right ears. St. Clair's Hospital was an imposing building of glass and concrete in the heart of Midtown. Lucas watched the comings and goings for a few hours, studying the patterns of entry and exit, the shift change times, the moments of greatest confusion at the reception desk. He knew he would only get one chance. If he was caught before he reached Sophia, he would lose not only the opportunity to help her, but would probably end up in some shelter from which it would be difficult to escape. He chose mid-afternoon, when there was more visitor traffic. He blended in with a group of people entering, keeping his head down and walking with the confidence of someone who belonged there. He passed the reception desk without being questioned, following the signs that indicated the floors. Sophia was on the 4th floor in the intensive care unit. Lucas took the stairs, avoiding the elevators where he would be more easily noticed. In the 4th floor hallway, things got more complicated. There were nurses bustling about, doctors checking charts, family members talking in low voices. Lucas had to use all his skill at becoming invisible, that ability he had developed on the streets, to simply not draw attention. He moved slowly along the walls, as if looking for something, until he identified Sophia's room through a glass window. She was there, surrounded by machines that blinked and hummed, with tubes and wires connected to her small body. She was so pale she looked translucent, and her eyes were closed. Lucas felt his chest tighten. He had to get into that room, he had to talk to her. But how? It was luck itself that created the opportunity. An alarm went off in another room, causing a sudden commotion in the hallway. Nurses ran toward the sound, doctors were called, and for a few seconds the hallway was relatively empty. Lucas didn't think twice. He opened the door to Sophia's room and slipped inside, closing it quickly behind him. The silence inside the room was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the monitors. Lucas approached the bed, his hands trembling. Sophia looked so small, so fragile, that he was afraid to even touch her. But then he saw something that made him act on instinct. One of the tubes connected to her arm seemed positioned strangely, and the monitor beside it showed numbers flashing in red. Lucas couldn't read those numbers, but he knew how to recognize when something was wrong. Without thinking about the consequences, he gently adjusted the tube, repositioning it to where it looked more natural. Then he held Sophia's hand delicately, as if holding something very precious that could break at any moment. And he whispered her name, over and over, like a prayer. Sophia, Sophia, Sophia. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and then something happened that Lucas would never forget for the rest of his life. Sophia's fingers twitched, slightly, almost imperceptibly, but they moved. Her eyes began to open slowly, as if waking from a very deep sleep. And when they finally focused, they found Lucas's face leaning over her, and something like recognition shone there. The moment Sophia's eyes opened seemed to suspend time in a way that defied all laws of physics. Lucas, who had spent the last few days in a constant state of tension that left his body aching and his mind exhausted, felt something break inside him. A dam of accumulated emotions he didn't know he was holding back so forcefully. It had been days of fear, hope, determination, and despair, all compressed in his small chest, and finally finding release in that magical and terrifying instant. The girl looked at him with an expression that mixed confusion and recognition, in an almost indescribable way, as if she were trying to remember a distant dream that had been real, but that her brain insisted on classifying as fantasy. Her eyes, still cloudy from medication and the time they had remained closed, moved slowly, focusing and unfocusing as they tried to adjust to the room's light and the reality of being conscious again. Her lips moved first, without sound, just forming words that Lucas could read through the delicate movement. "You came back. You really came back." It was then that reality brutally shattered that moment of magic. The monitor alarms began to blare in sequence, a shrill sound that echoed down the hall. The room door burst open and nurses rushed in, quickly followed by a doctor on call. Lucas was pushed aside. Someone shouted, asking who he was and what he was doing there. Hands grabbed his arms and pulled him away from the bed. The chaos that followed was overwhelming. Security was called, questions were asked in an accusatory tone, and Lucas found himself being dragged out of the room as he tried to explain, his voice lost in the general tumult. But before he could be completely removed, before the room door closed between him and Sophia, his eyes met hers one last time. And what he saw there wasn't fear or confusion. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was life. Edward Thompson was in a tense meeting with lawyers and financial advisors when he received the call from the hospital that would make his world stop once again. The news came in a jumble, fragmented by the urgency in the nurse's voice, words tumbling over each other in an attempt to convey information quickly. His daughter had had a sudden change in her clinical status. There was a boy in the room when there shouldn't have been anyone. The monitors had gone off in a frightening sequence. The situation was technically under control, but he needed to come to the hospital immediately. The businessman left the meeting without even saying goodbye, leaving important contracts and documents worth millions of dollars scattered across the polished mahogany table, and drove to the hospital in a state of absolute terror that made his hands shake on the steering wheel. The entire drive down Park Avenue, swerving around buses and cutting through side streets he knew by heart, his mind created increasingly dark scenarios. Was this the end? Had Sophia finally succumbed to the terrible disease that had been consuming her for months? Were they calling him to say goodbye? At every red light he was forced to stop at, he felt the anguish tighten its grip on his chest. When he arrived on the 4th floor of St. Clair's, he found a scene he didn't expect. Security guards were restraining a dirty, scrawny boy who was yelling something about poison and lies, while doctors and nurses moved with urgency. Melissa was there, obviously distressed, trying to calm everyone down and talking about intruders and danger. Dr. Allen was beside her, his expression grave, explaining something to other doctors in a low, professional tone. But what really captured Edward's attention was seeing Sophia. For the first time in weeks, his daughter's eyes were open, not just open, but focused, conscious, alive in a way he hadn't seen since this all began. She was looking at the boy being restrained, and there was something in her expression that Edward couldn't immediately interpret, but it made him hesitate before making any rash judgments. Edward approached the bed, ignoring the commotion around him. He took Sophia's hand and she responded to his touch, her fingers lightly squeezing his. She tried to speak, her voice coming out as a hoarse, weak but persistent whisper. "Dad," she said, and that single word carried a weight of meaning. Edward felt tears burn his eyes. She hadn't been able to say anything for weeks, and now here she was, trying to communicate something with growing urgency. He leaned in closer, putting his ear to her lips. What Sophia said in the next few sentences changed everything. With broken words and pauses for breath, she recounted fragments of memories she had stored away during the weeks she had been conscious, but unable to move or speak. She talked about conversations she had overheard between Melissa and Dr. Allen, about things she didn't fully understand, but that scared her. She talked about how the medicine made her feel worse, not better. She talked about the boy who visited her, and how he was the only thing that made her want to keep fighting. Edward felt the floor disappear from under his feet. He looked at Melissa, who was now watching the scene with an expression she was trying to control, but that was beginning to crack at the edges. He looked at Dr. Allen, whose professional face hid something he had never noticed before. And he looked at the boy, who had stopped resisting the guards and was now just watching, with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. Lucas seized the moment of tense silence that had fallen. His voice came out shaky but determined as he said he had proof, that he had recorded conversations, that he knew what was happening. He pulled the small recorder from his pocket, now a bit dented, from the struggle with the guards, but still working. He offered it to Edward with trembling hands. The reaction was immediate and varied. Melissa tried to intervene, saying it was ridiculous, that a street kid was obviously trying to take advantage of the situation, that you couldn't give credit to intruders and liars. Dr. Allen agreed, suggesting that Edward was emotionally fragile and shouldn't make decisions based on the baseless accusations of a disturbed child. But there was something in their voices, an urgency that wasn't there before, a need to control the narrative that sounded false to Edward's ears. The businessman took the recorder with hands that shook uncontrollably. His hands, which had signed million-dollar contracts without hesitation, which had shaken the hands of company presidents and influential politicians with unwavering firmness, now trembled as he pressed the play button on that old dented device that a street kid was offering him as a last hope. What he heard over the next few minutes was devastating in a way he never imagined possible. The voices were unmistakable, too clear to be denied, too precise to be questioned. Melissa and Henry coldly discussing medications that shouldn't be administered, diagnoses that had been deliberately manipulated to show the progression of a disease that might not even exist, calculated and meticulous strategies to control not only his assets, but his very sanity, ensuring he would be too emotionally broken to react or question. Every word was a stab in a different part of his heart, every revelation a shock that made him stagger internally, even as he remained externally motionless, absorbing the horrific truth unfolding through the recorder's small, distorted speaker. The silence that followed the end of the recording was thick and suffocating, filling the hospital room with an almost physical weight that seemed to compress the air and make it hard for everyone to breathe. Edward couldn't look at Melissa, couldn't even turn his face in her direction for fear of what he might do or say if he allowed the rage and betrayal to fully penetrate his consciousness. He couldn't even completely process what he had just heard. The implications were too vast, too deep, too cruel to be absorbed all at once. It was too much. It was impossible, but it was real. The woman who slept beside him every night, who comforted him when he cried for his daughter, who held his hand during the most difficult doctor's appointments, who organized every detail of the treatments with impressive efficiency, was slowly, methodically poisoning the child he loved most in the world, and the doctor he trusted blindly, whose recommendations he followed without question, whose diagnoses he accepted as absolute truths, was an active accomplice in this unimaginable horror that had been unfolding day after day right under his nose. Melissa tried to defend herself. Her voice rose in pitch, wavering between indignation and desperation. She said it was a setup, that the boy had manipulated the recordings, that it was an extortion attempt, but her words sounded increasingly hollow, increasingly desperate. Dr. Allen remained silent, his professional expression finally crumbling to reveal something close to panic. Edward did something that surprised everyone. Calmly, almost mechanically, he took his phone out of his pocket and called his personal lawyer. He asked him to come to the hospital immediately and to bring the proper authorities. Then, he called the hospital director and requested that other doctors from outside Sophia's care team come to evaluate his daughter immediately. And finally, he asked the security guards not to let anyone leave the floor until everything was sorted out. The hours that followed were a blur of events that Edward would later have trouble piecing together completely. Independent doctors examined Sophia and her medical records. They found alarming inconsistencies, prescriptions that made no sense for the given diagnosis, dosages that seemed calculated to worsen rather than improve her condition, tests that had been clearly altered. When they analyzed the medications Sophia had been receiving, they discovered substances that shouldn't have been there, compounds that perfectly explained her progressive symptoms. The formal investigation began that same night. Authorities arrived, statements were taken, evidence was collected. Melissa was detained when she tried to leave, her explanations becoming increasingly contradictory and desperate. Dr. Allen, trying to downplay his involvement, ended up revealing details that only reinforced his guilt. Documents were found, suspicious bank transfers, recently changed insurance policies, drafts of psychological evaluations ready to be signed. The plan had been meticulous, but not perfect. And now, it was disintegrating before everyone's eyes. Edward spent that night by Sophia's bed, holding her hand and repeatedly asking for forgiveness. How had he not seen? How had he been so blind, so trusting, so foolish? His daughter, trying to be strong even in her fragility, squeezed his hand back as if trying to say she understood, that she forgave him, that the important thing was that they now knew the truth. And Lucas, the boy no one saw, who had been treated as an intruder and a nuisance, sat in the corner of the room watching everything with wide eyes. The security guards had been ordered by Edward not to touch him, to treat him with respect. Someone had brought him a sandwich and a juice, which Lucas devoured without even realizing how hungry he was. He still couldn't fully process what had happened. He just knew that Sophia was okay, that she had woken up, that the truth had been revealed. As the night wore on and the legal proceedings took their course, Edward began to understand the magnitude of what this boy had done. Not just for Sophia, but for him. Lucas had saved his daughter from a conspiracy he couldn't see. He had risked his own safety repeatedly, had persevered when everyone ignored him, had kept a promise made to a sick girl simply because he thought it was the right thing to do. When they were finally alone in the room, just Edward, Sophia, and Lucas, a different kind of silence settled in. It wasn't the heavy silence from before, laden with despair and helplessness. It was a silence of relief, of gratitude, of possible beginnings. Edward looked at Lucas for a long moment, really seeing him for the first time. He saw a thin, dirty boy with tattered clothes and worn-out shoes, but with eyes that shone with an intelligence and determination few people possessed. The businessman was not one for public displays of emotion. He had built his reputation on being controlled, rational, always, in command. But in that moment, something inside him broke in a necessary and healing way. He stood up, walked over to Lucas, and, to the boy's surprise, knelt in front of him. He met his eyes and said, with a voice trembling with sincere emotion, that he could never thank him enough for what he had done, that he had saved the one thing Edward loved most in the world, that he was a true hero, the kind who doesn't seek recognition, but acts because his heart tells him to. Lucas didn't know how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like that. No one had ever looked at him with that respect and gratitude. He felt a strange lump form in his throat, and before he could control it, tears began to roll down his dirty face. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of an emotion so big it couldn't fit inside his small chest. Edward hugged him, and Lucas, who couldn't remember the last time he had been hugged by anyone, finally allowed himself to be just a child who had carried a weight far too heavy for far too long. Sophia watched from the bed, her own eyes glistening with tears. She reached her hand out toward Lucas, and he came closer, holding it gently. She whispered a thank you that carried far more meaning than those two simple words usually would. And Lucas, finally, allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, his world could be different from the one he had always known. The days that followed were a succession of revelations and changes. The media got wind of the story, and although Edward tried to protect his family's privacy, some details inevitably leaked. The papers talked about the cruel conspiracy, the dishonest doctor, the ambitious wife. But they also talked about the hero boy, the unlikely friendship, about how salvation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Sophia was transferred to another hospital, where specialized doctors began the delicate process of detoxification and recovery. It was explained to Edward that the damage was not permanent, that with the right treatment and a lot of time, his daughter would make a full recovery. It would be a long journey with challenges and setbacks, but there was real hope now, not just empty words of comfort. And Lucas, for the first time in his life, didn't know where to go when night fell. But Edward did. He had made a decision that wasn't based on fleeting gratitude or guilt, but on something deeper and truer. He had seen the boy's character, had witnessed his courage and kindness, and he knew that Sophia needed him as much as he needed her. So, with the simplicity of someone who finally understands what truly matters in life, Edward asked Lucas a question that would change their lives forever. "Do you want to stay? Not as a visitor, not as a guest, but as part of the family?" Edward's question echoed in the silence of the hospital room, both a promise and a challenge. Lucas looked at him, then at Sophia, who was smiling faintly from the bed, and felt something he couldn't name take over his chest. It was fear and hope mixed together, the dizzying sensation of being on the verge of something immense and unknown. His whole life, he had learned not to expect anything from anyone, not to form bonds that would inevitably break. But here, in this moment, was a real offer of belonging, and it scared him as much as it drew him in. "Do you want to stay?" The question reverberated in his mind. Stay where? In the enormous mansion he had broken into, with people who lived in a world completely different from his. How could he fit into a life he didn't know, into routines he had never experienced? Lucas opened his mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. He could only manage a nod, a small movement that carried the weight of a decision that would transform his existence. Edward understood the boy's hesitation. He didn't expect Lucas to simply accept without fear or doubt. He knew there was a chasm between their worlds, and that building a bridge across it would take time, patience, and a lot of love. But he was willing to make that investment, not out of obligation or superficial gratitude, but because he had seen something in that boy that he recognized in himself from a time long past. A quiet strength, an unshakable determination, and a heart that, despite all adversity, could still love and protect. The first few days were, as expected, filled with adjustments and discomfort. Edward arranged for Lucas to have his own room in the mansion, with a comfortable bed, new clothes, and everything a child could need. But Lucas spent the nights awake, staring at the too-high ceiling, feeling the too-clean sheets, unsettled by the silence, broken only by the distant sound of traffic. He was used to noise, to constant movement, to the need to always be alert. This quietness made him restless. During the day, he accompanied Edward on daily visits to the hospital where Sophia was recovering. The doctors had started a careful detoxification protocol, gradually removing the harmful substances that had accumulated in her system over the months. It was a slow and sometimes painful process. Sophia had moments of intense weakness, periods when she could barely keep her eyes open. But between those moments, there were windows of growing lucidity, moments when her true personality began to re-emerge. Lucas would sit by her bed and pick up where he had left off months ago, telling stories. He talked about the city she didn't know, about the hidden places only those who walked the streets discovered, about the interesting people who crossed his path. Sophia listened intently, her eyes regaining the curious sparkle that had vanished during her illness. Sometimes she asked questions, her voice still weak but growing steadier. Sometimes she just smiled, and Lucas learned that her smile was worth more than any material reward he could imagine. Edward watched their friendship deepen with a mixture of joy and melancholy. Joy at seeing his daughter reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Melancholy at recognizing how much he had failed as a father in recent years. He had let himself be consumed by work, by ambition, by the pursuit of material security. And in that pursuit he had become vulnerable to people who exploited his loneliness and pain. Melissa had entered his life at a moment of fragility, offering comfort and companionship, and he had accepted without questioning her true intentions. The official investigations moved forward quickly. The prosecutors discovered it wasn't the first time Melissa and Dr. Allen had worked together. There were other cases, other victims, a pattern of behavior that revealed not just greed, but a calculated cruelty. Fraudulent insurance policies, manipulated inheritances, vulnerable people exploited in their weakest moments. The case became a priority for the authorities, and Edward was called in multiple times to give testimony and provide evidence. But he tried to shield Sophia and Lucas from those sordid details. He wanted them to focus on recovery and building a new normal, not on the horrors of what had happened. He hired the best lawyers not to seek revenge, but to ensure that justice was served and that those people couldn't hurt anyone else. There was a subtle but important difference between those goals, and Edward was learning to recognize it. Meanwhile, at the company, new challenges arose. The shareholders, who had already begun to question his leadership during the months he was away caring for Sophia, now used the public scandal as ammunition to question his judgment. There were tense meetings, difficult conversations, veiled threats of motions to remove him from the presidency. Edward, who had always put the company first, found that his priorities had changed. He wasn't willing to sacrifice time with his recovering daughter, nor to let Lucas feel abandoned just as he was trying to adapt to a new life. It was Sophia who, in a moment of surprising clarity, gave him the perspective he needed. She had improved enough to sit up in bed, though she still needed support and frequent rest. During one of Edward's visits, she took his hand and said something that left him speechless. "Dad, you spent so much time building things out there that you almost lost what you had in here." Those words, spoken with the sincerity of a child who had almost lost everything, touched Edward in a way no business advice ever could. He began to delegate more, to trust his team, to accept that he didn't need to control every aspect of his business. He discovered there were competent and loyal people who could take on responsibilities, while he focused on what truly mattered. And strangely, the company didn't fall apart. On the contrary, without the constant interference of Melissa and Henry, who had infiltrated various operational aspects to facilitate their plans, business began to flow more smoothly. Lucas faced his own challenges of adaptation. School was particularly difficult at first. Edward enrolled him in a respected institution and arranged for tutors to help him catch up on the years he'd missed, but none of it prepared the boy for the culture shock of being around children who had never had to worry about food or shelter. There were curious stares, invasive questions, some cruel comments about his origins. Lucas, who had developed a tough shell on the streets, found that this armor didn't work as well in an environment where the wounds were psychological, not physical. There were times he thought about giving up, about going back to the streets where at least he understood the rules. But whenever those thoughts arose, he remembered Sophia, how she was fighting every day to regain her health, how she counted on his presence. And he remembered Edward's words, which he often repeated: "Family isn't about where you were born, but about who chooses to stand by you in the tough times." The household staff also had to adapt. Some were genuinely welcoming, treating Lucas with kindness and respect. Others maintained a professional distance that barely concealed their discomfort with the situation. And there were those who, though they said nothing openly, made it clear through subtle gestures that they did not approve of a street kid living as part of the family. Lucas felt these tensions, but Edward was always watchful, correcting inappropriate behavior, and making it clear that Lucas was his son as much as Sophia was, and that he expected everyone to treat him as such. It was Edward's distant relatives, however, who presented the most significant resistance. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who had barely shown up before, but who had a financial stake in the family business, began to question Edward's decision to take Lucas in. Some spoke openly about diluted inheritances, others about social propriety, and some even insinuated that Edward was acting impulsively, still traumatized by recent events. These conversations were tense and painful, but Edward stood firm. For the first time in years, he was making decisions based on love and values, not on social expectations or external pressures. Sophia was discharged from the hospital 4 months after that dramatic night. She still needed regular physical therapy and constant medical follow-up, but the doctors confirmed that, miraculously, there was no significant permanent damage. Her young body had managed to recover from the toxic substances, and now it was just a matter of rebuilding her lost strength and stamina. The day she came home was transformative for everyone. The mansion, which had felt like a silent mausoleum for months, suddenly came to life again. Lucas helped prepare Sophia's room for her arrival. Together with Edward, they chose fresh flowers, arranged her favorite toys, and made sure everything was just as she liked it. When Sophia finally walked through the front door, leaning on Edward but walking on her own 2 feet, her eyes filled with tears. They weren't tears of sadness, but of a deep and complex emotion. She was home, she was alive, and she was not alone. The routine that settled in over the following months was unlike anything any of them had known. Edward drastically reduced his work hours, prioritizing being present for dinners, for bedtime talks, for the ordinary moments that make up the texture of family life. Sophia and Lucas developed a true sibling dynamic, with all the joys and conflicts that entailed. They fought over silly things, shared secrets, and fiercely defended each other when necessary. Lucas slowly began to feel less like an intruder and more like someone who belonged. He discovered he had a talent for drawing, a skill he had developed on the streets but had never had the opportunity to properly explore. Edward arranged for lessons and quality materials and watched with genuine pride as the boy created works that showed surprising sensitivity and depth. Sophia became his biggest fan, filling the walls of her room with drawings Lucas made especially for her. The trial of Melissa and Dr. Allen finally took place almost a year after the initial events. Edward attended, not out of a desire for revenge, but because he felt it was important to formally close that chapter. The evidence was overwhelming, and both were found guilty on multiple charges. Leaving the courthouse that day, Edward felt not just relief, but also a strange compassion. Those people had destroyed their own lives for greed, and now they would pay the price for a long time. He chose not to harbor anger or resentment, but to focus on rebuilding what had been damaged. Sophia regained almost all of her physical health, though she still had moments of fatigue and needed regular checkups. But the psychological scars would take longer to heal. There were nights she woke up terrified, dreaming she was trapped in her motionless body again. There were times she was suspicious of medications or people in white coats. Lucas was always there in those moments, sitting by her bed telling silly stories until she fell back asleep. And Edward learned that healing was not a linear process, but a journey with advances and setbacks, requiring infinite patience and unconditional love. 2 years after that fateful night in the hospital, the Thompsons' life had stabilized into a new normal that was, paradoxically, both simpler and richer than before. Edward had completely restructured his priorities. The company was still important, but it was no longer the center of his identity. He had discovered that being a present father, someone his children could always count on, was infinitely more rewarding than any business success. Lucas, now 12, had not only adapted to his new life, but thrived in it. He still had moments of insecurity, instances where he felt out of place or questioned if he truly deserved all this. But these moments became rarer, replaced by a growing confidence in his place in the family. He never completely lost awareness of his origins, and that was a good thing. Those experiences had shaped who he was, had given him a unique perspective and a deep empathy for those who struggled. Sophia, at 10, had grown into a resilient and wise beyond her years girl. The ordeal she had been through left its marks, but it also gave her an appreciation for life that few children have. She took nothing for granted, cherishing every moment of health, every laugh, every hug, and in Lucas, she had not just a brother, but a best friend, someone who had literally saved her life and continued to save it every day just by being there. Edward would look at his 2 children and sometimes still be amazed at how life had changed. He had lost a wife he never truly loved, had almost lost a daughter to a cruel conspiracy, had almost lost himself in grief and despair. But in the process he had found something far more valuable. He had found the true meaning of family, the kind that is built not just on blood ties but on conscious choices of love and commitment. Their story eventually faded from the media spotlight. New scandals filled the headlines, new tragedies captured the public's attention. And that was exactly what Edward, Sophia, and Lucas wanted, to live their lives away from prying eyes, to build memories in private, to heal their wounds in their own time and their own way. They were no longer defined by the tragedy that almost destroyed them, but by how they had chosen to be reborn from it. On a Sunday afternoon, almost 3 years after Lucas had first climbed the wall of the Thompson mansion, the three of them were in the garden. Sophia was chasing butterflies as she recovered from a physical therapy session. Lucas was sketching under the shade of a tree, and Edward was simply watching, a forgotten book in his lap. The New York sun shone with that golden late afternoon light, and for a perfect moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Lucas stopped drawing and looked at the scene, Sophia laughing, Edward smiling, the gardens vibrant with life. He remembered what that day had been like, years ago, when all he was looking for was an old ball. He remembered the pale, silent girl in the wheelchair, the devastated man who could barely function. And now, looking at those same transformed people, he felt a gratitude so deep it couldn't be put into words. Sophia noticed he had stopped drawing and ran over to him. "What are you drawing, bro?" she asked, using the nickname she had naturally adopted. Lucas showed her the sketch. It was the three of them in the garden exactly, as they were in that moment. Edward came over too, looked at the drawing, and his eyes filled with that emotion he had learned not to hide anymore. "It's perfect," he said, and he wasn't just talking about the drawing. And it was true. Not because their lives were perfect or without challenges. There were still hard days, moments of doubt, scars that ached. But they were perfect because they had found each other when they needed it most, because they had chosen to be a family when it was the hardest thing to do, because they had turned tragedy into love and despair into hope. On that golden afternoon in New York, as butterflies danced in the air and laughter echoed through the garden, three hearts that had been broken by cruel circumstances now beat in sync. They had survived the worst life could throw at them, and in surviving they had discovered the best, the transformative power of an unexpected friendship, the resilience of true love, and the certainty that family isn't where you start, but who chooses to walk beside you to the end. Edward looked up at the sky, which was beginning to take on orange, hues with the sunset, and made a silent promise, not to people who weren't worth his time, not to empty expectations of material success, but to himself and the two young people who depended on him. He would never again allow the superficial to overshadow the essential, never again confuse achievement with fulfillment, never again be so blind that he couldn't see the miracles happening right in front of him. Sophia, tired but happy, sat on Edward's lap and rested her head on his shoulder. Lucas came closer too, sitting beside them on the soft grass. There, in that circle of affection, there was no room for the painful past, only for the precious present and the promising future they would build together. What began with a boy looking for an old ball ended with a family finding itself. What could have been the end became a new beginning. And in that garden, bathed in the golden light of a New York dusk, three souls marked by adversity discovered that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places, disguised as coincidences that are, in fact, destiny. Life would go on with its inevitable ups and downs. There would be more challenges, more lessons, more moments of joy and pain. But now they would face it all together, and that, they discovered, made all the difference. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward, Sophia, and Lucas has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of love, courage, and redemption, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you the most in this incredible story. Every day, we bring you intense narratives like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul and showing how hope can flourish even in the darkest of times. We'll see you in the next episode, with more stories that will stir your emotions and make you believe in the transformative power of true love.